everybody, and welcome to today's CX Quick Tips. I have, one of those people that I just love talking to, and probably we could actually go on for an hour and a half talking about what
Don't
is
tempt me.
customer journey management, but we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. We're going to make sure that we focus and give you value. And I want to welcome Ian Golding to the CX Quick Tips. Welcome, Ian.
Hi, Jim. It's lovely to be with you.
Oh, man. Okay, so we've already had a great off-mic discussion, and that discussion we can't divulge to you. We're going to keep that to ourselves. That's personal. But this one, we're going to open up. We're going to talk about customer journey management. And Ian, if you could, I think it's best to kind of explain that for people who aren't familiar, because we hear customer journey mapping, we hear those things, but really, what is customer journey management?
Okay, brilliant question. As you know, I love this question. And just to warn you and anyone that's watching, I'm about to preach. Okay, so I do preach from time to time. And the segue, Jim, is that we all know about customer journey mapping. And I will always argue that the world has got slightly over obsessed with journey mapping, almost to the point where it has become crazy, us investing huge amounts of time and money in creating beautiful looking pictures that we stick on walls and that become dust gatherers, which is the phrase that I coined a few years ago. And my concern about the way we develop and evolve customer experience competency is that far too often we operationalize things like journey mapping, but there is a lack of education as to why we're mapping it in the first place. And we're not mapping it to create a pretty picture. What we need organizations to understand is that the customer journey, whether we like it or not, whether we know it or not, is the thing that is bringing the experience to life for customers right now. It has always been there. It will always be there. And the reason we need to know what it looks like is because we need to know what works and what doesn't work in that journey. And unfortunately, far too many misunderstand the point, because the point is not to map it. The point is to manage the journey. Because what we need to understand is how capable is it at doing what we need it to do? And what do we need to focus on to make the journey better at delivering the experience we want our customers to have? And to do that, customer journey management is a cycle of continuous interconnected activities that include knowing who the customer is in the first place, so you can visualize their journey, so you can measure the journey to identify the small number of priorities that, if you focus on them first, will have the greatest impact on improving customer perception and, as a result, financial performance. And when you know what the priorities are, you then fix them, and you do that all over again forever. End of preach.
Okay, so for me, what you just explained right there, as I'm listening to you and you're going through that, is I start thinking about systems thinking and systems design, and I start thinking about, how do you transform? I start thinking about in a contact center where we oftentimes find ourselves talking and responding to the exact same questions for years, and we don't fix those things. Is that really what you're talking about?
100%. I am quite ambivalent about the way we articulate these things, and we come up with different terminologies, different methodologies, and it doesn't really matter what we call it. That this is all about continuous improvement, essentially. That the problem as we know it is that, firstly, many organizations don't really understand who their customer is in the first place, which has led to too many mapping journeys by channel or by product. What does the digital journey look like? What does the physical journey look like? But it's called a customer journey for a reason, because this is the interactions that your customer has with you across channels and across products. That's the first problem. Then we map the journey, but we don't do anything with it. Now, most organizations have only ever mapped their journeys once. They've never looked at them ever again. So, well, what was the point of mapping it in the first place? And then you look at the measurement. Many companies have been measuring the experience for years, but they don't even know what the journey looks like. So what they're measuring actually isn't representative of the truth. And I could go on. This is why I describe customer experience as a science, because if you don't understand the science, what you're doing is finding a piece of a jigsaw puzzle, but you're trying to make a picture from one piece, and it just doesn't work.
Okay, so for me, all right. I think this is how this conversation can expand into so many different places, because you're starting to get into, root cause. You're starting to get
100%.
into, you know, contributions and drivers and independent variables. And I mean,
Correct.
I think for me, as you're saying, just take customer experience is what we're trying to solve for, and we're trying to improve it, is that companies are going round and round and round and round and round, trying to essentially hit the thing that's going to have the greatest level of impact.
Correct.
Okay. So in your opinion, because I've seen a lot of people take these different approaches, and you said, we call them different things, this, that, and the other. What is really going to make the biggest impact on the customer experience?
Without question, and I'm going to articulate it slightly differently to the way you've done. If we really want to drive demonstrable, measurable change, there needs to be a reconnection with the understanding of the very simple historical principle of cause and effect. The measurable relationship between what we do as an organization and the way the customer feels about it as a result. And this is the marriage. I call it a marriage between process and journey. Process representing the things that we do every day, the journey representing what the customer interacts with as a result. And unfortunately, whilst you look back 30 years, I'm ex-GE, so I'm an ex-Lean Six Sigma guy, okay? 30 years ago, Jack Welch was banging that drum so hard, everyone listened, everyone got it, everyone knew. Unfortunately, you lose someone like Jack Welch from the business community. You become a little bit too sales-led, a little bit too obsessed with numbers, and you forget that those principles, that they were the right principles to follow. And so, unfortunately, that measurable understanding of the relationship between process and journey just doesn't exist in too many organizations. And if we can just start to create that alignment of the layers, measure what you do, but aligned to the customer journey, that's where you can start to see the relationship. And if you improve what you do, you will be able to predict how your customer is going to feel.
Well, when you say that, you and I had talked a little bit about the pendulum swing. We talked about relationships with the customer. We talked about relationships that we have, and how that has become more important, since the pandemic hit, which needed to happen, right?
Yes.
But when I start thinking about, everything that you're talking about in regards to, the process and doing all that, I start thinking about agility.
Yes.
Speed and agility are vital to an organization. And I've seen way too many organizations, well, let's map, let's measure, and they take it way too far. And then they've missed their
100%.
windows of opportunity. They've
100%.
lost a flood of customers. They've been disrupted. I mean, so how do you find the balance?
It's a brilliant point. I always describe the secret of the successful mapping of the journey to drive demonstrable change. And the secret is to keep it simple, which, as we know, ironically, it's very difficult for organizations that are so deep down in the detail of process. And this, again, is the point, that you've got to have an understanding of that relationship between process, because most organizations over the years have radically overcomplicated what they do. And their people are so deep down in the detail of process, task, that they can't see what the customer sees. And what you've got to be able to do is to drag them out of the details so they can see what the customer sees. And there is a methodology that I advocate, which is a very simple methodology of starting to visualize the journey as a level 0 journey, as I call it. Simplest visualization of all, that just allows you to understand the stages of the journey that the customer goes through. Now, many people understand the principle of stages, but you've got to visualize that first as a continuous, never-ending relationship. And what people realize is that when I get them to do this, they can only have a maximum of 7 stages. And people are like, no, this is too simple. And it's like, but then they think about it and they think, do you know what? You're right, that is it. We're immediately diving down. So it's simple is difficult. That's the sad reality, but that's what it requires. It requires people to just stop for a second. And what you've got to think about is what you're doing practical and actionable. If it isn't, then what are you doing it for?
Well, and I think you bring up a really interesting point, is that we can't do that ourselves because we know so much about our organization, about all of those nuts and bolts and all those I's, dots, and T's crossed, and we know all about that, that we automatically start falling into, that danger zone of, no movement.
Absolutely. 100%.
Ian Golding, always a great conversation. Thank you for joining us on this brief CX Quick Tips. If you could, please share with us how our listeners can get in touch with you.
Well, some would say that I'm far too visible, Jim. So if you go onto LinkedIn, you may well see this ugly face there somewhere, but please reach out to me on LinkedIn. That is probably the easiest way of getting hold of me. If you want to read more about the way I talk about this and journey management, it's all in my book as well, which you can buy at any good Amazon website.
Ian Golding is also a contributor to CX Global Media, and we thank you for sharing your wisdom and wish you the very best.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you, Jim.